Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Fruity Dashi Podcast, America's #1 premier anime talk show. I am Nicholas. I'm here with Lauren. We're going to talk about some anime today. Sorry, that's a joke from a conversation we had prior to the session. We're not going to be talking about anime.
We will not be talking about anime today, but I am also your now co-host of this not an anime, but might be an anime podcast here. It has been great to kind of go over the past couple episodes that we've been doing for you and trying to figure out, well, what are we going to talk about next? And so that's how anime came up. I guess link a comment in below if you want to know why anime came up in that.
Yeah, maybe that'll be something we talk about in the future. But for now, one of the subjects with regards to sort of like, so in this broad like season 4 arc, when we've been talking about all of these various issues related to like how to make game, what to do when you make game, a lot of our discussion has been focused on sort of the more creative and like technical side of things, like how do you manage all of that stuff. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about like sort of the social questions. And then when I say social, I don't mean like social media managers and things like that. I mean like, okay, now that you've made a game, or you have a vertical slice, or you have some testable thing, what the hell do you do with that? And so today's topic is sort of broadly going to be sort of like, I guess you could say, issues around playtesting. And we're going to get into a lot of like the differences between playtesting and quality assurance, otherwise known as QA. And then also just generally speaking, like if you have a game that you've been working on your own, like how do you find people to like take a look at your game and play it and have them give their thoughts? What kinds of people do you want to be playing your game? What kind of feedback do you want to be getting from them? And how do you sort of like cultivate a culture of people who can, I guess, give you the analytic feedback that we here on the podcast have largely sort of like placed within the person who is working on the game itself. It's like, how do you get other people to view your game analytically in the same way that we want you as designers to do as well?
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting here is, as we talked about playtesting in the indie space, a lot of this is people giving their free time for you, right? That they're not getting paid for, and they are really just fans of your product. And what we kind of realize is that it's a different mentality of someone who's a fan versus of someone who is, or whether or not they're a fan of, say, the product, it could be a fan of you, right? The developer, or a fan of that success. And maybe they'll encounter game breaking bugs, but if they encounter smaller things like text issues, or maybe there's just something that doesn't feel like it's in the right place, they haven't critically analyzed games enough times that could kind of consider that maybe that UI element is completely not supposed to be shifty. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. The UI element's kind of Z-fighting there, but it looks cool. So it looks intentional, right? Exactly, versus the developer, realizes that it's only on one level of the game, and the level happens to be the one that was like edgy, and he's like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And so I think that it's going to be really interesting for me, particularly because the indie space of getting your play testers is something that we already kind of have in, I wouldn't say like independent game developer students have QA as well, but we have quality assurance. Like we have QA in the larger game development space, and this is their job, right? It's to play test the game and also make sure that there is an intended feature. And that whole pipeline of getting QA involved into your processes so they know what is actually supposed to be happening, they can't do their job unless you basically give them like, this is the leveled sheet, this is how the level flows, right?
Yeah.
And it's very different than playtesting. So I think it's going to be really interesting, and it's a really cool topic for me, particularly when it comes to, playtesting functionality versus playtesting fun. Right.
Exactly. So there's one way that you can look at playtesting where So, in a recent Patreon episode, I talked about a couple of chapters from Scott Shell's The Art of Game Design, in which he introduces the concept of interest curves. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with what an interest curve is, well, one, it's not very curvy, it's more spiky. But what it is it's essentially a graph of the degree to which a person who is playing the game for the first time is getting like either excited or involved or even just sort of like subjectively assessing certain parts of the game better than others according to whatever metric you want to use. And so then what you do is you take that for the like every single, I guess you could say, event or thing that happens in a game, you plot it out and you will get a curve. And so one of the things that interest curves are used for is to try and determine what sort of like the overall flow of any slice of a game is. So like you can do an interest curve for a level, you could do an interest curve for a combat encounter, you could do an interest curve for the game as a whole. And so then what that does is like that particular kind of targeted feedback, you're asking for a very specific kind of reaction from your player at given moments in a game. And then you can kind of look at that and map out whether or not you think your game or like whatever slice of the game is flowing in the way that you want it to do. Like that kind of play testing is very focused on like I am giving my player very specific directions and I want them to give me very specific kinds of feedback because I'm going to use that feedback in a particular way. Whereas you might be just like giving a game to someone in a more free-form way to sort of like see what they do with it. So like, maybe you are in my position where you can't stop making tabletop games even though you're supposed to be working on a video game. And so you have this like mostly functional like say card game. You take the card game to your local game store on maybe a night when they're just like doing free play of whatever people happen to be interested in while they're there, and you're like, hey guys, maybe don't play Mansions of Madness right now and check out this weird card game that I created. And then you hand it to them and then you just see what they do with it. And so then in that sense, you're not necessarily giving them sort of like directions for like clear feedback and like specific things that you want to test. But maybe what you're trying to do in that instance is see what sorts of things about your game players reveal that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to see on your own. And so even though those are two very like different approaches to playtesting, they still fall much more within that rubric of I'm not hunting for bugs to be like fixed, but rather like I'm trying to see what the reaction from any given set of players is. Like I want to see how the game actually functions when it's being played and if there are things that like maybe I didn't notice when I was working on it.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, though, is that not only is it two different kind of stages of development, but as we look at like a playful production process, um, we kind of understand that there are like alpha testing, which is much more about functionality, or vertical
Yeah.
slice testing, right? Is this a
Yeah.
good example of, the indicative experience, right? And then there's a difference between alpha, right? And then beta testing, right? And so when you look at, there's clear directions, right? That you want the player, or maybe there's a specific emotion you want players to feel. Just emotions really come up in narrative design a lot because there is that. But I also
Yeah.
actually think it stems from emotions, unfortunately, are not just the sole purpose of narrative design. Emotions really came from, how sweaty is it to defeat a boss in Shadow of the Colossus, right? How
Yeah.
beautiful is it to defeat a boss? Like those are all subjective emotions, but they're going to come and be elicited from gameplay, not
Yeah.
just from, say, an overt storytelling kind of scene. And so when we look at it that way, having those types of directives is almost like functionality testing. I really want players to feel the grandiose and beauty of the moment. And can I do that through gameplay? Even when, right, art isn't exciting or, the mechanics aren't all there.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you have to build quite a bit to get to alpha testing. And I think that that's the difference than what Nicholas is saying here with the interest curves, where you can map out the flow.
Yeah.
In another example, you don't give the players any directions and say, like, hey, go free. And usually that happens around beta testing. And
Yeah.
I'm using these words because I think they're kind of common lexicon now in the gaming community for what an alpha project is, right? Early access, right? Versus beta testing, which you're like, the game is done. We just need to see where it breaks or how players are playing. So, particularly in shooters, we can change the meta game around how our content's being used. And
Yeah.
that's why there's a lot of open betas now, right? And it simply comes down to the fact that games are no longer made for 10, 20, maybe hundreds of thousands of people even. They're made for millions and millions of people. Like,
Yeah.
and I think that it, no, that's it, actually. We could edit that out,
Well,
or
and
we can
also
just
there.
leave
No,
it.
I think we'll just leave it because it brings up something that I think is really important that I hadn't thought of until you mentioned that, which is that there are also quite a few, especially live service games, are now kind of in a functionally like constant beta state. And what I mean by that is that, so like especially if you look at like a lot of MOBA games where they're like constantly changing the balance like drastically, not just a tiny little bit, like, tweaking number values here and there, but there will be times when like, okay, this hero no longer has any of the same abilities. All of their abilities have changed. They're now melee instead of ranged, and you're like, what? And it's like, well, because the game was getting stagnant, so we're just going to completely change the balance and see how players react and see how the meta changes. And it reminded me of the fact that for a very long time, like Dota 2 wasn't officially released until I think after the third international, or maybe it was even the fourth one. So for those of you who don't know, with Dota 2, that's the international is their like yearly worldwide competition for like the best team in the game. Uh, and so like the game was in a finished state that entire time that that it was still technically in beta. I don't remember exactly when it went into 1.0 release, but that it was, in many ways it was kind of a pointless shift into release because like the same way in which like the developers reacted and responded to players, it was the same before the release as it was after release. Like that process of like being in a kind of constant beta state continued because the Valve who developed Dota 2, they have changed the game drastically so many times even since that point, like even more than it was changed when it was still like technically in beta. And I think we've seen more and more of that, especially with live service games, because if a game is going to have the longevity that, say, like a League of Legends has, or that a Fortnite has, or that a Dota 2 has, like in many ways, it kind of has to constantly be a different game. And the only way you can do that is through like making constant changes, constant beta, like quote unquote beta testing, but testing of the sort that Lauren is talking about, where you're sort of like throwing something out there, like seeing how players react, and there's this kind of interesting feedback loop as a result, where the design process is not like I, the designer, do something, take it or leave it. And it's like I, the designer, do something. I see what you, the player, do with it. Then I respond to that. You respond to what I put out there. And then that is a nice circular development cycle in which kind of everybody's getting what they want. Everyone is sort of feeling heard in that situation, which is why earlier I characterized this process as a social one, because if you look at it primarily in the way in which it's done in, like, say, major studios and large studios who can hire people for this job, it's a job. Like, they're doing it as a job, and they're doing it in such a way where, like, they may be giving honest reactions, but it's not necessarily about those individuals who are, like, feeling like they're part of sort of like a community structure. Whereas when you're talking about indie games in particular, as like smaller scale games, generally speaking, you need that sense of community precisely because you can't pay them. Like you need the testing, but you also can't pay. Like you don't have the
Right.
money to pay. So you need to be giving them something. And I think what you give your play testers on that scale is that sense of like being involved in a kind of communal structure.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what's really interesting here is that the lines really blur in creating a community between any sort of stage of your project, whether you're two developers, making something in your basement, to your 2,000 developers working at Bungie, right, making like the next big like IP title,
Yeah.
right? And I think that the process really blurs here, particularly after the pandemic, because we have Discord And we've always had some sort of like chat mentality or forums,
Yeah.
but Discord has made it really, really easy to give your community a link. And then they can go in with voice chats, whether it's with the developers or it's just with themselves, to be able to play your game and then post live reactions of them playing it. And this is
Yeah.
actually incredibly important, not only for playtesting currently active games in live service, but also playtesting games that have been sunsetted.
Yeah.
And so I think that because you can still learn a lot from the games you have launched right previously.
Yeah.
So it's been really, really cool to kind of see the way they go out. And so I think in the social dynamics that Nicholas is bringing up, I think it'd be really interesting for us to kind of go through the process of creating those communities, right? What are some incentives or what are ways in which these communities form? And way, I'm like tripping over my words here. Sorry.
I
And what
mean,
are other ways
yeah.
in which you build that community to create it consistently, right? Because the
Yeah.
players are going to change in
Yeah.
a community. I think that is just uh, a well-known fact that your World of Warcraft playtesters, right, who were playing World of Warcraft years ago, maybe came back to replay Classic, but they're not the same playtesters that were like, hey, let's play, we're all the way through retail, right? Like those are
Yeah.
very few and far between. And so what I'm not trying to do is how to say best reward or incentivize community members, right, to engage with the
Yeah.
content, but rather to understand not only how can we build communities, right, from indie to double A to triple A to quad A or whatever that is, um, to how can we also kind of reinforce like what is that community like from a very high level perspective, right? Because I
Yeah.
am not a community manager. That is not my job. And I actually have never been in QA, but I have trained people from QA into different roles so that
Yeah.
they can start to think like a designer, right? And so I think that it's really, really kind of that's where we got into, right? Is QA having a different mentality than just playtesting, but where do those lines blur and how do you, right, as a developer, either try to find those playtesters or craft a community once you have had success,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's very different depending on that level of success.
Yeah, the scale definitely changes how things work qualitatively. So I'll use my own experience as an example here. So I made a while back, and Lauren has played this game. She was actually a play tester for this game, technically. Um, I made a game called Snow, which was not necessarily something. I mean, maybe at some point in the future I'll work on it more extensively and I'll try to put it out there. But I made it more as kind of for two reasons. One, to exercise my own personal demons because it is a very personal game. But two, also as a kind of like proof of concept for developing a particular kind of narrative system using like card based gameplay. So, like I said, Lauren has played this game, but also for me, one of the things that I did was I turned first and foremost to friends, but specifically to friends whose opinions I trust with regards to like tabletop gaming. So, for example, a friend of mine owns a used bookstore here in where I live. I'll dox myself. I live in Iowa City, Iowa. Here in Iowa City, and they also sell. So, in addition to selling used books, they also sell new tabletop games. But they definitely have a very like curated selection of what games they sell, and that's partially because they and their partner play test absolutely everything that gets offered to them before like it sees like any shelf time in their store. And so like I gave a prototype copy to them because it's not just that they're my friends, it's also that they have sort of a degree of expertise. And more specifically, they have a broad range of knowledge of like the kinds of games that exist out there. And so that they can then tell me like, oh, this is doing something similar to this, or this is doing something very different, very unusual. And also like they're close friends, so they'll be very honest with me. And I really want to emphasize, like, if you're someone who's sort of like working on something for the first time and you want to just sort of like keep your game small, it is actually really important to find people who will be honest with you. More specifically, be honest with you in a caring way. because that kind of feedback can be very hard to take, especially if what somebody wants to tell you is like, there is something like this needs to be reworked from the ground up. Like they're not going to want to tell you that, but they need to be able to be comfortable telling you that, and you as a designer need to be someone who is comfortable hearing it. So that's like that's the first level, is like sort of like the inner circle. But then if you want to broaden the inner circle, especially if you're talking about like physical games, like tabletop games, you might want to look into sort of like what game stores are in your area, or if there are any like hobbyist groups that are like public groups, and like to come to them and say, hey, you know, I've been working on this game. Would it be possible for me to get like, say, an hour on a Saturday or a Friday night where I can bring my game in and people can take a look at it? Like that's one option. Another option would be to sort of go to your public library and say, hey, you know, I want to set up a time when like I have my game available and people can come in. And if they're just like around in the library, like if you have a game that's more geared towards kids, you can have it set up in the children's section, maybe even it's like offer to be part of, like I know in the past at my local public library, they've had tabletop games as part of sort of like general kids nights, and so you can see if you want to be part of that, like that's an option. Or if it's more like teen centric, you can see if there are like maker spaces or things that are like more teen focused at your public library. So then the next level above like your inner circle would then be the people sort of in your area, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be the town that you live in. It could be like the regional area. So like there are a lot of, I mean, smallish cities that are near where I live as well. There's actually a fairly large city that's just north of us, and so you might want to like look around to like groups and to like stores and like various like public places where you might be able to just like show your thing to other people. And that's really sort of like, that's what's most important at that initial stage, is because I think what you have to realize, and this is definitely true when you're talking about the AAA level, like that kind of playtesting isn't just about getting feedback about on your game. It's also kind of partially about marketing.
Yeah. And I
and so,
think,
yeah, go ahead.
and I was going to say, and kind of piggybacking off of there, I think that there are three kind of circles of feedback and playtesting that Nicholas has identified here. The first is that inner circle, right? I think it's someone that you have to trust, or it's an existing community fan base, right? That's like, this is the game that's going to give us what we want. And that's really, really important, because if you kind of, in writing, it's if you don't know who your reader is, you don't know who you're writing for, at least in my opinion. And if I am my own reader, that can actually be enough. Like, that's fine. Just so you're clear. So if you're making a game for yourself and you're like, this is the game I am happy I can play, that is okay. But when you start asking other people their opinions, your inner circle is, okay, you may not think exactly like me, but we both really love, you know, gothic vampire novels, right?
Yeah.
So I've written my gothic vampire novel just for me. Can you read it? Right? And then you start, that's when you would probably edit it for your friend, because you're like, okay, I know that not everyone's into, like, I don't know, sparkly vampires, for example. So maybe take them out of your book. And then, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how that got through. We'll see.
What's with the Twilight hate?
Yeah. No, I'm very pleased that it brought a new generation of vampire lovers into existence, is what I should say.
That's very diplomatic of you, Lauren.
Thank you, Nicholas. Anyway, but that's really important, right? Is if that gets through your inner circle, you're like, whoa, I'm onto something here. So now you go to the public and you get other readers. And so I'm kind of using the book example, right? Because none of you are probably out there going to make a book. But I think it's important is that group of strangers is still small, is still collective, and they're all interested. They're all kids, right? Yeah. So this is a game for kids. Only kids will play it. But your next step, right, and I call it largely the larger public group, is that once you have a small public group, right, a small kind of beta testing community, now you basically go to the internet. And I describe this group as the people whose opinions you don't actually care about, because you're outside of your market demographic. You now recognize that your kid's game is not really for teenagers, but I wonder if a teenager would like my game, right? Yeah. And then they play it. Now you realize, hey, 13% of teenagers really love Hoot Hoot, the owl dating sim. And you're like, right? It's not actually, or Hoot Hoot Owl Friendship Simulator. There we go.
Wait. Is this supposed to be like the Hoot Owl Hoot cinematic universe?
It is the Hoot Owl Hoot cinematic universe. Okay, yes, it is. Right. Yes, it is.
That is a real game, by the way, people, in case you didn't know.
That is a real game, by the
Yeah.
way. I was like, can I pull a game that I know that I have played that is quite enjoyable and yet definitely not for me?
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
answer was yes, I can pull that out of my brain in 28 seconds. And so Hoot Hoot, Owl Friendship Simulator, is this game that we have now created
Hoot Hoot
live
Litter
for you here. But
Hoot
what I'm
Hoot
saying is I
Literature
don't,
Club.
yep,
Sorry, go ahead.
the Hoot Hoot Literature Club. And I don't care about, I care about my target demographic, right? That's your smaller circle, right? That's the one that's right outside your inner circle. And I really don't care, right? If the first person shooter genres or the people that hate board games get it, like they love it. But what I do want to know is, do they get it? Do they understand it's not for them? Or hey, 13% of the people that I thought wouldn't like this game were like, hey, I'd love this game if it was a little more mature than in theme. And suddenly you can go, hey, they'll probably play it with their kids, right? Or their teenagers, they'll play it with their siblings. If they're
Yeah.
adults, they'll play it with their kids, which
Yeah.
now means I've probably hit on Hoot Hoot Literature Club is actually can be for all ages, right?
Yeah.
And that's all ages is now like a community thing, but you've slowly kind of built this reputation. And it's only really after that playtesting do you get to understand your market. Because maybe Hoot Hoot Literature Club was for kids, and all of the kids are like, we don't get it. And all of the teens love it. And they're like, this is the game for us. I can't wait to play it with my friends. And suddenly you're like, well, I was going to bring this game to market. All my friends hate it. But when I extended it one more time just to see, there was this whole other untapped market of Hoot Hoot Literature Club fans.
Yeah.
And now you get to make the decision, if this was a business, if this is AAA just goes, we're changing our market strategy. We're changing our game to better service those customers. What did they want? Versus when you're making something for yourself, you now can go, I didn't want Hoot Hoot Literature Club to be like interpreted like X. I really wanted it to be for children. Right.
Yeah.
And then in the publishing world, you could say, I wrote Hoot Hoot Literature Club for kids. And while originally the publisher was like very excited, they're like, actually, owls are kind of out, but cats are in. So can you change this entire book to be about cats? Because kids
Meow
want
Meow
cats
Literature
now.
Club.
And now it's Meow Meow Literature Club. And you're trying to wonder, and then your editor has to go through and any feather reference becomes fur. And then it's like a whole mad dash because publishing is also just as cutthroat, I think, as games industry publishing in general, too.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to kind of better articulate those three circles in a really fun way for you guys. So you could understand that for some game properties, you may never want it to leave the strangers / honest, or maybe not, no.
Yeah.
I know so many board game developers and tabletop developers that their game ideas never leave their inner circle because their inner circle is about 10, 15 people. And I have played fantastic tabletop adventures set in like Fallout or Tomb Raider or some, huge IP that this person is never going to be able to release because it's Tomb Raider and Fallout, right?
Yeah,
like they're
exactly.
never going to do it, but they're just testing such cool systems that it ends up becoming like, as long as a game of Mega Civilization, or it becomes a long running campaign like you'd play in Dungeons and Dragons. And so your games never have to leave your inner circle. But what Nicholas is talking about is when your game has already left your inner circle, right? Whether it's a sequel,
well, yeah,
or
and you want it to. Yeah, exactly.
That there's inner circle, there's that close enough to what your target market, right, demographic was, and then there's people you don't give a fuck about, but it could potentially be an untapped market, right? And then and I think that's just really, really that's really what we're talking about here, right? And it kind of goes to any sort of game, whether it's tabletop or video or Hoot Hoot Literature Club.
And this actually brings up a really important point. I don't know if Lauren intended to do this or accidentally, but usually she intends to do it, but it just looks like it's accidental. So, haha. Anyway, but the idea that through the playtesting process, you as a designer actually discovering or being honest about where you want your game to be situated. Do you actually want it to be this breakout? Do you want it to be Vampire Survivors? Do you want it to be this game that's this breakout indie success? Or do you just want it to be something that maybe you make you publish, say, I don't know, a couple hundred copies of, and it roughly covers the costs of making it, and that's all you ever really wanted to do? Or do you want to just literally it to be this little prototype that you made and that you occasionally bust out for your friends because maybe, you know, your friends are interested in games too, and it could be just be a little thing that you have like amongst them? Like, it's perfectly fine to I do feel sometimes that people, when they say like, I want to be a game designer, or like, I want to make my own game, they sort of get it in their head that the only measure of success for creating that game is if it like sells and you make a bunch of money off of it. Which really, when you think about it, that's an extremely narrow concept of success. Because like, you would need that to be true if like that is going to be like a major source of income for you. Like, for example, this podcast, quote unquote, makes money, but it doesn't make enough money for either Lauren or me to even begin to like factor it into our, like, we have day jobs that pay for 99.9% of our stuff, but the podcast does pay for itself plus a little bit. And I'm very happy to keep it going and also to be making bonus content for our patrons. By the way, this is a Patreon segue. So you can go over to patreon.com/Footydashi. Again, you have to build community as a way to market yourself. So using the podcast to market us. But like, to go back to my own example, like this card game that I made, Snow, like, I haven't taken it any further than, say, like, my inner circle. I could very easily, I have some friends who work at a local game store. I could take it to them and they'd probably let me like set up shop on a Saturday night and I could like show it to people, but I haven't done that. And the reason I haven't done that is because that's not why I made the game. I made the game, one, as a proof of concept, and two, to deal with my own like psychological issues. Those two things were achieved. Great success. Like, to me, the game is a success. Like, I did it. And that's all it has to be. It doesn't have to be more than that.
Yeah. And versus I'm the one over here that is like scheming about ways to get it into more players' hands, because it is a very good game, everyone. Like, it's very interesting.
It is good.
Even
it is
its,
good. Yeah.
Even if it's like kind of prototyped in its alpha stage, is what I should say. It's like an early access alpha kind of tabletop game. Is that it is a very good game. It's incredibly unique. And I definitely would love for more people to play it, just so that they would have an opportunity to experience the same thing that I got to kind of experience when I played it. Right. And I think that's the mark of the good game.
I can't go out to lunch with every single person who plays the game. That doesn't work.
No, you can't. But you can go out to lunch with me. That was great. That was both the best and worst decision I made of my life, was ordering a salad in the Midwest and forgetting that it's not the size of a San Francisco salad, sharing it with my partner, and it still was not the correct decision. And then going for high tea afterward, where every pastry was the size of a Midwest pastry.
Tea was great. Tea was great, though.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, tea was great.
Tea was great.
Yeah, lunch was not great.
Lunch was not great. Like, it was great because we got to play a game. It was just more like, I should not have eaten lunch before going to high tea. But I was trying to be healthy, but that was not the case. It was just big. Oh man. Anyway, I ate way too much, and then we had dinner right afterwards, and I was like, I couldn't even eat dinner. I was like, I can't. I have physically eaten too much. Okay, none of you guys needed to know that, but now you know that I have limits, and my limits are basically giant salad from the Midwest, which was delicious. It was just too big. Eating high tea straight after it, which is, you know what that is. It's a bunch of scones and pastries and desserts and sandwiches, and then going straight into basically like a hot pot dumpling meal. It was a lot. Oh, and this was all within like 6 hours, 5 hours of each other. Like, it was just, I think anybody would have been a bit, full.
I'm surprised you didn't like explode.
I had to stop eating. I shouldn't have eaten as much at high tea. That was the thing. I didn't realize that. Yeah, no, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about family meals. I learned a lot about how you cannot reject food. And I was like, oh man, this was a good lesson for day 1 or day 2 of living in the Midwest for like a week. Yeah. It was over the holidays, so that's why there was so much food, guys. It's a holiday thing. Okay. So going back to the only measure of success is not making money. And when we look at not just playtesting, but bringing your game to market, Now I think this is going to move into that kind of second understanding, not just of
Yes.
playtesting and quality assurance, but the reason why AAA developers have quality assurance to begin with and why it became an department is because we needed players, right, who wanted to test our specific whatever properties our game company was making and basically tell us that this is shippable, right? This is what
Exactly. Yeah.
shippable quality is. And shippable is incredibly subjective depending on what game you're making. So I think going into the indie space is going to, or the independent kind of developer space here, is just going to help us kind of free up some of the kind of trips that you can get into when we look at AAA games, because I think the quality for AAA games is just so astronomically high. Versus, we're not necessarily going to talk about Vampire Survivors. That's obviously like the other end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So kind of staying in a vein of, say, let's say Slay the Spire, Half-Life 2, right? I know Half-Life 2 was a critically acclaimed game, but I don't think they were thinking of themselves as, say, AAA at the time. They were, but it's different than if Half-Life 2's graphics and kind of conceits were around now. I think players would go, this should be higher fidelity, quote unquote. And so I think we're going to stay in that, right? So if everyone understands, you can go look up Half-Life 2's, graphics and etc. Slay the Spire is great, right? It's just two totally different games. So that's why I was just like, this is the very wide and yet narrow middle, right?
Yeah.
Of like Dwarf Fortress to Naughty Dog.
Slay the Spire is a really interesting case because, like, the game when it first came out in its sort of basic state was pretty straightforward. It built on, so like for those of you who aren't familiar with Slay the Spire, it's essentially like a card game that also has like a dungeon crawling aspect to it. So, and it's also a bit of a roguelike in that regard because like the way the dungeon crawls are structured, it's like it's
you're right. Nicholas is like, she sounds like she's doing this accidentally. I intentionally chose Slay the Spire because you can pre-order the Slay the Spire board game. And so not only is it a video game, it is also coming out in tabletop.
Slay the Spire 2 is currently in development. I don't know if they're in a beta phase.
Yeah. So continue with your Slay the Spire is a very good example.
Yeah, so it's a great example because it's a game that sort of like combines elements of like other types of games. Like it doesn't reinvent a ton. Its creativeness really sort of lies in the way in which it combines pre-existing like genre conventions in interesting ways. Hades is another game that does this like very well. So what's interesting about its development history, from what I recall, so don't like nail me to a cross on this one, is that like it is another one of those examples where like it built gradually over time as a result of the interaction between like the developers and the community. Another good example of a game that did this was Factorio. Factorio was a game that Factorio is still, it's made a lot of money now, but it started off relatively small. It was relatively straightforward, but it developed over time as like they interacted with people in their community. And community is an interesting concept here because something that has become more and more common, especially in the past decade, is the way in which developers relate to people who are like then publicizing their playthroughs. So if you're talking about YouTubers or streamers, but just people who, generally speaking, will take their thoughts and ideas and opinions of the game and then they will broadcast them on whatever platform they happen to be creating content for. And so there is a lot of ways in which sort of community means, so like if you're looking on like the marketing end of a community structure, like that's sort of more marketing focused. But also there's sort of like the broader, like larger, like beta tester player base that is there not only to sort of like give feedback to the developer, but also to sort of like build the word of mouth structure that a lot of indie games need in order to sort of like go from being something that is moderately successful to being like your Slay the Spires or your Factorios, games that like are not super complicated and is definitely like the graphic fidelity of Factorio is not amazing. Like, but they became huge games precisely because the developers invested a lot of time and a lot of care in that whole process of like feedback and response to a building player base. But I do want to note that as you sort of like go from being, pardon my French, dog shit tier to being, oh hey, actually people kind of know who I am tier. You're not really anywhere in the like millions of sales, but you're in like the 10,000 sales territory. Like once you're in that territory, you you have to sort of be very careful about what kind of community you're cultivating around your game, be it on like, a Discord server or through something much more systematic. Like, a lot of the beta testing like systems that larger companies use are like very like have like tools built into the game itself. You see that especially with like a lot of
Yeah.
MMOs. But once you're moving from dog shit tier to, hey, maybe people kind of know who I am tier, you'll start to realize that back when you were in the dog shit tier, there was a much more like kind of friendly, everybody sort of knows each other. You spend a lot of time talking about like what anime you like or like what kinds of coffee you're into. But then when you get into the like, oh, I have a publishing deal now and people kind of sort of know who I am, then you have kind of a fan base. And fan bases are not necessarily going to make for good playtesters.
I
And
will note that I'm
sorry,
not
go ahead.
100% loving that Nicholas keeps calling it dog shit, because that's not true. And he's being a little bit self deprecating here. So, to all of you who are working on a project that you feel nobody knows who you are, what your name is, you are perfectly fine. You are not dog shit. You are a developer.
Yeah, I
Do
shouldn't have
not.
called it that. I
No,
apologize.
it's okay. You are self deprecating, and I just wanted to call that out. Um, but really quickly, before we move on from going from like a level where you feel like you're making this game for yourself, or maybe your friends or a couple people on the internet that happen to like it, as soon as people do know you, who you are, and you are now like a recognizable face in the industry,
Yeah,
even if it's just the game development forums, or right, if you're a fan fiction author or fan fiction writer, webtoons, webcomics, right? Suddenly you're be going, oh, people kind of know who you are. The difference is more that people know when you change something. And I think that's what's really, really important, right?
yeah,
To kind of identify from what he's talking about is that as he goes into kind of saying now that you have fans, it's like you go from people who kind of respect your work to understanding maybe more of the intimate aspects of why you have created something, to now they go from just critiquing the what, right? What they
exactly. Yeah.
see and how they see it.
And to brace yourself for the fact that if you are going to go after financial success with your game, which is a perfectly valid thing to want, I'm not criticizing that, but you are going to have to recognize the fact that a lot of players are going to treat their relationship to you as consumers. And you're not dealing with people who sort of like have a mutual interest in you doing well. They have an interest in you doing well insofar as then those people get, I guess you could say, a return on their investment, or like whatever it is that they're getting what they're paying for, which is a very different kind of relationship. And it's one where if you're not used to it, and if you're not used to the very like oftentimes harsh critical feedback that you will get as a result, because it's a very selfish mode at times. I'm not necessarily trying to say that all fans are like assholes about this, but that their interest is fundamentally different from like the circle of friends, or even just sort of like the community of people that you uh sort of inculcate around yourself when you're not necessarily trying to make a game for like broad commercial success. And
Yep.
just like to brace yourself for that, because it's going to be different.
Yeah. And I think what's really great here is that we're moving not only from like playtesting to potentially you're going to bring your game to market. But I think this is something we touched on earlier in the episode when I was talking about the three inner circles, right? You have your close friends, you have the people that you are hoping, right? And you know will enjoy your game, of which fans are, right? They're your current
Yeah.
market.
Yeah.
So if you've already made a game and you're making a sequel, this is who you should be going to, right? Like Slay the Spire 2, for example, will heavily rely on the community from Slay the Spire 1.
Yep.
And when I mentioned that those players are going to know when you change something, that's when they kind of want to understand why, how, and then what, right? Is that change going to impact about the experience that they loved, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when you look at marketing for these bigger titles, particularly like Last of Us and Last of Us 2, right? You can see that Last of Us 1 had a very specific kind of narrative, right? That it was going for.
Yeah.
Whereas Last of Us 2 also then, right, shifted that narrative. And a lot of players who liked Last of Us 1, right, looked at Last of Us 2 and was like, oh man, too woke for me. And they'll say that with maybe any game, right?
Yeah,
But I'm bringing that as an extreme example, though there are a lot of minor examples I could. But just to kind of clarify, right, what that second circle really is. It's an existing fan base, or it's the strangers at the library because you're making a kids game that you know are kids, right? It's basically the target demographic. Now, the third portion, right, these people who I'm telling you don't really give an opinion about, they can also still be your fans. Yeah. And those are your kind of outside your target demographic, but likely what we call in the business world like potential, right, market or untapped market. So those are all your biz dev finger excitement jazz hands words here.
Yeah.
And when you go to those people, this is really important to kind of help wrap up our episode, is to kind of understand not just the difference between playtesting and say QA, but now you need to understand the difference between playtesters, right, and QA developers, right, as well. Yeah. Like Nicholas said, QA developers are getting paid, but in many cases, your playtesters are not employed by your company, right? Whether you're, and this is especially true, right, in indie development. But we do realize is, I think the question we need to kind of ask ourselves as we wrap up this episode, and particularly for yourself as well, if you're in the gaming community, you've probably wanted to get in on early access, open betas, right? Yeah. What makes a good playtester?
I would say, well, the interesting thing is like what makes a good playtester is kind of a broad question, but also I think you need to approach it from two different directions. One, like if you yourself are like invited into a closed beta, one of the things that you want to be aware of as a playtester is that it's not about you. It should be about the game. In other words, the attitude you should go into it with is like not like how do I have the best experience for me, but like how can I, through my knowledge and my interest in what I'm doing with this particular game, make it so that it is a really great playable experience for as many people as possible. In other words, it's still a bit of a feedback loop, but it's one in which you need to sort of understand that as a tester, it's no longer just about like, hey, I'm the developer's friend and I can just say whatever. Like you have a responsibility to it as well. So then from the devs direction, the thing that you want to realize is that as you move from the sort of like the inner circle or sort of like friendship tier to sort of like a broader public, is that you need to communicate very clearly and very effectively with the people who are going to be playtesting your game. And not only that, but you also then, when you make changes, or if you're making Vampire Survivors 2 and you want to change something drastically, you want to be able to communicate to your player base, your existing player base, why it is that you're making those changes and what you think it will offer them in terms of like, an involved version of the gameplay experience. And so that just to wrap that up then, from the playtester side, you need to understand that you have a sense of responsibility in terms of what you're doing. It's not just about you. And then from the dev side, you need to understand that like you're going to actually have to develop your communication skills, or if you don't have them, maybe hire somebody who will do that. And that's why community managers exist, because you need to be able to, like, if you have an existing fan base, if you have an existing player base, you want to be able to keep them on board as well as grow the game into a broader audience.
And with that, I think that we should wrap up here, because really what we've done now is not only take you through like the entire, you have a game and you're wanting to play test it, and maybe you now are throwing, I should get some QA people. I'm looking at your partners or your siblings or someone and be like, hey, play test my game. But we also then have gone all the way into what I've described as change logs, right? There's like a really huge amount of community management and a lot of consumer kind of, I would say, misrepresentation in this process, because at the end of the day, we are making games for you. Exactly. And it's really important that whether you're a streamer or a playtester or someone that's just playtesting like your friend's game, right? You're kind of playtesting a new world, that we want you to enjoy it. Right? Maybe you're not happy about it in Dungeons and Dragons because I've killed your character, but you enjoyed the experience leading up to that moment of death. Right? And us kind of play testing through that kind of experience with you is what brings us joy. And so with that, we're going to end on happy July, everyone. I hope that this podcast continues to bring us joy, as we hope it brings you joy together. And please take a moment to not only sign up for our Patreon over at patreon.com/Ruodashi, but also please comment and rate us on Spotify and particularly on Apple iTunes, where those ratings really, really do matter and keep us kind of in check for if this podcast is something that is really giving value to your lives. As always, drop a comment anywhere, and we will see you next time.